I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you the latest news from across Ukraine. We analyse Vladimir Putin's surprise visit to North Korea, and we go to Germany to hear about Ukraine's tricky start at the European Football Championships.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 18th of June, 2 years and 117 days since the full-scale invasion began. Today, I'm joined by our associate editor, Nicholls, assistant comment editor, Dearnley, and our guest is British-Ukrainian journalist Andrew Todas. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
Well, hello, David, and hello wherever you are. Let's start up in the northeast of Ukraine, on the Volchansk area. So President Zelensky, speaking in his daily message last night, said that his army is repelling the Russian offensive around that area in the Kharkiv region. He said, our forces are gradually pushing the occupier out of the Kharkiv region, and I thank every warrior and every unit for this, who are clearly fulfilling their task. Now, this chimes with what we've seen in the last few weeks and reported on, this very notable lack of any Russian advance in the area or any success in exploiting it. I've said many times, it's either an advance in and of its own right, in which case it ain't going anywhere, it hasn't linked up even, or it's the diversion to draw Ukrainian forces away ahead of some big push elsewhere in the Donbass perhaps, and that hasn't happened. So it's just been wobbling around in the border area, really. So it has been nibbled away at, and it is only marginal gains that Ukraine's making against it from what we can tell. However, we report Russian marginal gains, so we'll report these ones as well. So it looks as if that area there is slowly receding back to the Russian border. Now, that effort has picked up a pace since the US and others gave permission for Ukraine to attack Russian forming up points, logistic bases, headquarters locations, etc., inside Russia with Western donated weapons. Obviously, very limited permissions given there in terms of geographic limit in the north and only to the north, but a start. And if the sensible analysts can draw from it and infer and assess that actually that those permissions being given have directly led to this push back by Ukraine, then perhaps that policy will be extended elsewhere. Now, President Zelensky's comments were echoed by General Alexander Syrsky, the head of Ukraine's armed forces. He also said Russian forces are making every effort to capture more territory before Ukraine receives F-16 fighter jets. So Alexander Syrsky, he said Russia was well aware of the impending arrival of the F-16s. I mean, they'd have to be, quite frankly, along with other weapons and equipment, but insisted time will play in our favour and its chances of success, that's the Russian military, chances of success will decrease. He added, the command of Russia's troops is currently making every effort to increase the intensity and expand the geography of hostilities in order to maximise the depletion of our troops, disrupt the training of reserves and prevent the transition to active offensive actions. I mean, you'd sort of expect him to say that. I just wonder if the, not often repeated, but there's a steady drumbeat of references to F-16s and fighter jet training. I wonder if that is, it is happening, the training is happening, so partly it's true anyway, but also it's interesting messaging. And I note General Syrsky's reference there to the transition to active offensive operations. Again, maybe just to shore up a bit of domestic morale, but also messaging. Everything's a message. Now, next one. Overnight, a drone attack has set several oil storage tanks ablaze inside Russia near the town of Azov in the south. It sparks a large fire. We got it on our website. You'll see it elsewhere as well. This area is practically on the coast, right at the most northeasterly point of the Sea of Azov. Ukraine didn't immediately claim responsibility, but we know has carried out similar attacks on Russian energy facilities before. An intelligence source, a Ukrainian intelligence source, has told Reuters today the attack was conducted by the SBU, the security service of Ukraine. The local regional governor said oil product tanks caught fire in Azov as a result of a drone attack. According to preliminary data, there were no casualties. You'll see thick smoke billowing out of the multiple storage tanks there in efforts to dampen it down. Now, sticking with drones, and Ukraine's Air Force said it destroyed 10 Shahed-type drones launched by Russia overnight. They were destroyed over the regions of Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk, according to the Air Force, although other drones were said to have hit residential areas in Mykolaiv Oblast, which resulted in casualties. Now, from those 10 the Air Force said they shot down, no casualties reported, but regional authorities across the country said Russian attacks against Ukraine over the past day had killed at least 3, injured another 28. Poltava Oblast, that's to the southwest of Kharkiv, was hit, as was Kharkiv itself, and Zvanivka and Chasiv Yar in Donetsk Oblast. Those are the last two from Governor Vadim Filashkin. Russian attacks against Kherson killed 2, and Governor Alexander Prokudin reported 3 people injured in the Nikopol district of Dnipropetrovsk, including a 71-year-old woman. Luhansk, Sumy and Zaporizhia Oblast also came under attack, but local officials there in those areas reporting no casualties. Now, I note today's British Defence Intelligence briefing out on Twitter. They say Russia has likely taken control of Novolik-Sandrivka. That's about 20 k's northwest of Avdiivka. UK Defence Intelligence say that by taking control of that village, Russian forces are increasingly able to threaten the main T0504 road that runs southwest northeast in this section towards Bakhmut area. It's said to be one of the main supply routes for Ukrainian forces further east. British Defence Intelligence further say it's highly likely that Russia's next objective will be the village of Vozdvizenka. That's 2 kilometres further northwest, and that would be in an attempt to sever the road and disrupt Ukrainian logistics. Now, just a pause. We covered it some months ago, but just when we use this kind of language of likely and highly likely and so on and so forth, this isn't just language. It comes from the UK Defence Intelligence probability yardstick. And yes, I have got the mug. Now, they put this out some time ago in order to, well, they say it's a common yardstick to convey the language of uncertainty. Conversely, the language of certainty, to know quite what a figure they're putting on it. And there is a figure. So for likely, when they say something is likely, they mean it's between 55% and 75% correct, and highly likely 80 to 90%. Now, of course, this is the product of analysis, so there are flaws in it. Inherently, there are flaws in the data, in the man-machine interface, the swivel chair interface, etc., etc. But it's all an effort from UK Defence Intelligence to put some figures around the language they use, and to give us, this is all open source, to give the public a way of judging how certain they are. So that's where you'll see the language, and you'll see it online about exactly what all the numbers mean. And then finally, a new anti-tank drone tank is said to be on its way to Ukraine. A new Frankenstein is called air defence tank, designed to shoot down drones and missiles, is thought to be on its way to Ukraine from a German arm manufacturer. This is Rheinmetall. They've announced they're going to mount the Skyranger anti-aircraft system on old Leopard 1 tank hulls, basically aiming to update the Gepard, if you like, the sort of anti-air defence there. So Bjorn Bernhard, who's the head of land systems at Rheinmetall, speaking to German newspaper Bild, said there are still many Leopard 1 main battle tanks on whose chassis we could mount the Skyranger turret with the 35mm caliber automatic cannon. Ukraine's army, we think, have got close to 100 Leopard 1 tanks, so they've got the kit to do this if they wish. Rheinmetall have only recently developed the Skyranger system. It's covered in sensors, 360-degree view of the battlefield, said to be the sort of the latest thinking in armoured anti-drone capability. Mr. Bernhard made his comments at a new workshop recently opened by Rheinmetall in Ukraine, somewhere in Ukraine, we're not exactly sure where. It's a new secret location, apparently. It's where the company is going to be repairing German-made tanks that have been damaged at the front. At first, only Marder IFV's infantry fighting vehicles are going to be repaired there, and the older version of Leopard tanks could be on their way. But the company said that it wants to repair more modern Leopard 2 inside Ukraine as well. Mr. Bernhard said, "We are planning for the long term in Ukraine. We're not just supplying equipment and then withdrawing. We're showing that we'll be there permanently and supporting Ukraine." Interesting in the context of Western boots on the ground and civilians in warfare, direct participation in hostilities, all that kind of stuff, whether they're covered by Geneva Conventions and so on and so forth. A topic for a much wider debate and worthy of a wider debate, but worth noting, David.
Well, thank you very much, Dom, for all of that. Francis, welcome back. Let's go to you next. What's taken your eye diplomatically?
Well, thanks very much, David. A Russia-focused diplomatic segment today. Let's start with Putin's high-profile visit to North Korea, which, in a statement put out beforehand, he has praised for firmly supporting Moscow's war. Now, we understand Putin is set to arrive in the north late tonight with a large delegation of ministers in a trip suspected to be really about securing more munitions for his war on Ukraine. As listeners will know, Western intelligence agencies argue, and there's ample evidence to support this, including seen by us here at the Telegraph, that North Korea has become a key munitions supplier to Russia, with satellite images suggesting a massive uptick in shipping between the two remote harbours on the Sea of Japan. Of course, we've also seen missiles landing in Ukraine that we are absolutely confident come from North Korea. So a very valuable ally for Putin, which I think explains this, even though there are other elements to it as well. Ostensibly, the trip, quote, will put bilateral cooperation onto a higher level with our joint efforts and will contribute to developing reciprocal and equal cooperation between Russia and North Korea, Putin said. So very thin on the details, the usual diplomatic speak that one would expect. But the significance, as I say, is that this will be Putin's first visit to Pyongyang in over 2 decades. And it can be interpreted in two ways, really, neither necessarily mutually exclusive. First, as evidence of strengthening alliances between hostile powers like China, Russia, North Korea and Iran, or of Putin's desperation, still relatively isolated as he is on the world stage. Russia, just bear in mind, used to be a member of the G8, after all, and now has to go and shake hands with the leader of a pariah state, an antiquated Chinese proxy modelled on a pastiche of Stalinist communism. I mean, it's quite a come down from where Russia was only a few years ago. The fear, of course, from a Western perspective, is less about what Kim Jong-un is giving Putin. That's already clear in the vast swathes of shells and other ammunition, albeit quite a lot of it pretty old, that he's getting. But what Kim Jong-un is getting in return? Is it submarines? Is it nuclear intelligence? We can only speculate, but it's certainly a concern for Western nations. My own view, of course, is that another benefit that's huge for North Korea is that international clout that it cherishes. So, of course, it was very, very pleased and made all sorts of warm statements when it got that photo op with Donald Trump as president. When you have big world leaders visiting a tiny, most of the time pariah nation, that matters for them. It means that it can be highly effective for their internal propaganda, but particularly in its external propaganda to the world. It's a country that wants to be taken seriously, and Putin is feeding that. Now, in terms of the concerns I articulated there from a Western perspective, as Joe Biden's National Security Council spokesman John Kirby told reporters, we know North Korean ballistic missiles are still being used to hit Ukrainian targets, and there could be some reciprocity here that could affect security on the Korean peninsula. And that, of course, is the concern for South Korea of these strengthening relations, particularly in terms of weapons exchange and intelligence exchange. Now, interestingly, this hasn't been reported too widely, but Washington has also condemned Putin being set to visit Hanoi for 2 days after his trip to North Korea, condemning Vietnam for allowing him in. So Washington said no country should give Putin a platform to promote his war of aggression and otherwise allow him to normalise his atrocities. That's from a spokesperson for the American embassy. If he is able to travel freely, it could normalise Russia's blatant violations of international law. But as Sarah Newey writes for us, a regular on the podcast, of course, this attitude is at odds with the general sentiment across Southeast Asia at present. In the capital, a city dotted with prominent Soviet-style buildings and statues, many were eagerly anticipating, she writes, the Russian president's visit. Now, as listeners will know, Moscow has enjoyed deep ties with communist-ruled Vietnam, with thousands of people from the Southeast Asian country travelling to study in the former Soviet Union during the Cold War, including the head of the Communist Party. Historically, Russia has also been Hanoi's largest weapons supplier, of course very significant in the Vietnam War, and today the country continues to extract oil and gas from Vietnamese fields in the disputed South China Sea. So given all of that, it's not surprising that Putin might be somebody welcomed. But it's interesting about the US statement is that the US is a far bigger trading partner for Vietnam than Russia is. I think second only to China, although it's possible they've overtaken them now. Hence why that condemnation may carry some implications. Now, staying on the subject of Russian alliances, Beijing has lashed out and told NATO to stop shifting the blame, their phrase, over the Ukraine war after Jens Stoltenberg called for China to face consequences over alleged efforts to rebuild Russia's defence industry. Quote from China, "We advise NATO to stop shifting the blame and sowing discord, not add fuel to the fire and instigate confrontation, but rather do something practical for the political settlement of the crisis." That came from a foreign ministry spokesman who said that what NATO have said is an arbitrary smear. Now, this is typical of Chinese responses when they're called out for something that they've been doing which they don't like. So I wouldn't read too much into the rhetoric per se. But if listeners are interested in Stoltenberg's wider remarks, do check out Joe Barnes's exclusive interview with him for us, which we put in yesterday's episode. It's very interesting to be hearing from him. And just lastly, for this segment, zooming in on Kremlin politics specifically, Putin has sacked 4 deputy defence ministers and appointed one of his relatives to the role as he continues to carry out that sweeping purge of officials we've covered in detail in recent weeks. So Anna Zhuynev, and forgive me if I've mispronounced that, the daughter of a late cousin of the Russian president, is married to the country's energy minister and is sanctioned by the British government, among others, after using her ties to Putin to become the president of a coal mining business. Her maiden name was Putina, and she also runs the Defenders of the Fatherland Fund for war veterans. Also promoted in the reshuffle was Pavel Fradkov, the son of one of Putin's former prime ministers. He previously worked in the presidential administration. Their promotion comes as Putin is clearly putting more trust in the children of close associates rather than outsiders after a series of disasters in the early months of the war. Leonid Gorgin, previously Russia's first deputy finance minister, has also been promoted to first deputy defence minister in a reshuffle designed to increase the transparency of financial flows. A further sign, as we've discussed many times, of that shift where Putin is favouring 2 economists over generals to run the Ministry of Defence as it tries to put the country on an even stronger and firmer war footing, as well as putting a signal out to the rest of the world that Russia is, whether true or not, committed to victory in Ukraine, or at the very least retaining vast swathes of territory that it has seized so far. I don't think we should underestimate the signals that this is projecting to send, rather than it merely being about actually securing up the economy. So prioritising loyalty and financial assuredness over military experience, David. It's quite a gamble, but it remains to be seen whether it will be one that will pay off.
Well, thank you very much, Francis, from that. I will come back to you shortly, but Dom, do you have any thoughts yourself on this reshuffle?
Yes, I do. A couple, quickly. Just on the last point Francis made there about Leonid Gorgin, who, as he says, was previously Russia's first deputy finance minister, now promoted to first deputy defence minister. That speaks again of, as Francis said, putting economists in charge of the military affairs. Now, you might say that's sensible because so much of this revolves around, so much capability starts and finishes with how much money you've got and how you're managing your budget and all that kind of stuff. But, you know, you do have to be pretty good at the military stuff as well. So I wonder what background Mr. Gorgin has of managing major equipment programs and all that kind of George. So, you know, that I thought was interesting and perhaps the only sort of rational thing out of this. The rest of it, look, I mean, hey, promoting your relatives and your friends. We've all seen this, right? This is the act of a narcissistic bully. We've all met them. We've all worked for these kind of people, those people that would just wish that they could clone themselves and have them in the office rather than have to go through all that messy business of interacting with the carbon-based life forms. They'd much rather just, if they were in charge and if only they could have sort of 50 of them in the office, everything would be brilliant. The next best thing to that, of course, is promote your family and your friends and just tell them what to do. We've all worked for them. I worked for an SO2, Staff Officer Grade 2 in particular, who was exactly that. You could see it in his eyes. It rue the day that he had to speak to other people and just wished he could work 25 hours a day. Having thought about this and seeing these people, worked with them, I do firmly believe it comes from a position of paranoia and weakness, absolutely not strength. It does speak of a lack of trust, this centralisation. I mean, it's bad in and of itself. It's going to lead to groupthink. And I don't think it's a bad thing to actively rail against that, because you can end up doing stupid stuff. So groupthink is one of the natural sort of results of this kind of activity. It really speaks of a lack of trust and that you don't rate the people around you and you don't like the people around you, and it all has an effect. I remember in one of my jobs, I worked directly for Mark Carlton-Smith, former head of the army, former director of Special Forces, and his mantra to the staff and to command would be delegate until it hurts and then delegate some more. It really was that, just push the decisions down to those people absolutely at the coalface who can see the problem, know how to act. They know their limits. If you trust them, they will respond appropriately. They only seek permission when they believe they're going too far, etc., etc., etc. The complete opposite of what this is, this whole system that Putin set up. And, pay your money, take your choice, see whichever model sort of works for you. But I saw that Mark CS's mantra of delegate until it hurts, delegate some more. I saw that work. Okay, I knew that worked in peacetime, that worked in staff, that worked in training, it worked on operations. So that's where I'd stick my money, and that's the complete opposite of what we're seeing Putin do here. So, quite interesting, but ultimately comes from a position of paranoia, I believe.
Well, thank you, Dom. Francis, can we come to you very briefly for some final diplomatic updates?
Sure. Well, I'm aware, David, we've done a lot of examinations on sanctions recently, which is, of course, a really important subject. We've looked at where they've succeeded and where they have failed or are failing. And in the past week or so, how Western nations are trying to do more to close loopholes which are enabling Moscow to receive vital resources from Western sources, often by third-party organisations or indeed countries. And on this theme, I just wanted to draw attention to another project, this time by Denmark, which is considering ways to limit the passage of oil tankers, that shadow fleet carrying Russian oil through the Baltic Sea, in a move that could trigger quite an intense diplomatic confrontation with Moscow. As we've reported previously, Russia sends about a third of its seaborne oil exports, or about 1.5 of global supply, through the Danish Straits that sit as a gateway to the Baltic Sea, meaning any attempt to halt supplies would send oil prices higher and hit the Kremlin's finances. But Denmark's foreign minister has said that his country has brought together a group of allied nations to evaluate measures targeting that so-called shadow fleet of ageing ships transporting the Russian oil through that route. And a good indicator of how much something rattles Moscow is how bellicose they are in response. And indeed, Russia's ambassador to Denmark, Vladimir Putin, has said that imposing restrictions on ships passing through the straits would be unacceptable. So one for us to watch. It is fascinating seeing how this debate over shadow fleets and sanctions is evolving. Some quite notable steps recently as we try, the West, being the we there, to find a means of limiting Russia's access to valuable cash throws, but particularly in terms of material. And it will be there, of course, that there'll need to be as much, many would argue, of a concerted effort so that you avoid a situation, particularly with vital weapons parts, that it's coming through, say, Central Asian countries, and thereby, say, British exports of certain parts have gone up 1,000% in somewhere like Kyrgyzstan, which then, of course, we all know are actually going onwards to Moscow, which seems to be happening, as we've talked about in the past. So I just wanted to draw attention to this, David, that there's a lot of negativity around sanctions, and for very, very justified reasons. I think in many ways they have not delivered anywhere near what was hoped for and indeed promised by some. But that's a long way from saying that it hasn't been effective in certain areas, and indeed if nothing had been done, that the position would not be considerably better for Moscow, and also that there isn't work also being done now to try and close some of those loopholes. So I think it is important to draw attention to them when they occur. The other economic story I did just want to refer to, because I believe it's underreported, is that Ukraine was unable to reach an agreement with a group of bondholders over reconstructuring around $20 billion worth of international debt during formal talks which closed on Monday, which just raises the spectre that Ukraine may, and I emphasise that, may slip into default unless something quite substantial changes, which it might well do, because that would not be a good prospect. Just for a bit of context here, the agreement with holders of international bonds allowed Ukraine to suspend payments after the invasion, but that ends in August, hence why the talks have been revived. They've gone on for nearly 2 weeks, seeking to reconstructure the debt in order to retain access to international markets while meeting International Monetary Fund's demands for that restructuring. Although there are large disparities between what the parties expect that deal to look like. So a statement was put out by the government saying Ukraine and the ad hoc creditor committee will continue engagement and constructive discussions through their respective advisors, and it will continue with a view to making further progress and reaching an agreement in principle at the earliest opportunity. Personally, I think that there will be some sort of agreement that's reached. I think it will be seen as too harmful diplomatically, internationally, for Ukraine to default. But even so, it just does speak again to the economic front, which remains as vital for Ukraine in many ways as the military one. The only way that Ukraine is able to keep financing this war is through the economic support that is being offered by Western nations and backers. And if that were to greatly reduce, if the political will was nullified over the coming months of substantial elections, that would have as significant an impact potentially as on the military front. So just something for us to continue to monitor alongside the energy front and the military front and the political front. But we will keep at it, as we always do.
Well, thank you very much, Francis. I know you have to head off. Where are you going? I think you're going to our sister podcast, The Daily Tea. What will you be speaking about there?
Yes, so we do a daily podcast which covers all other issues that are going on, and they've asked me very kindly to just go on there and speak a little bit more about the implications of North Korea and that visit by Putin. And I think I'll also be offering a few reflections on the manifestos here in Britain. Of course, we've got a general election on July 4th. Do wonder why they picked that date, one for our American listeners. And so I'm going to talk about the manifestos and how they are particularly talking about Ukraine or not, as the case may be. So that'll be what I'll be reflecting on the Daily Tea. So if you want to check it out, that'll also be going out around the same time, I think, as Ukraine the Latest.
Thank you so much, Dom and Francis. Moving away from military and diplomatic updates then, let's go to Germany and join friend of the podcast, British-Ukrainian sports journalist Andrew Todas, who's been following Ukraine's European Championship campaign. I caught up with Andrew earlier. Here's our conversation. Andrew, it's great to hear from you. Let's start with the football. Ukraine had their first game of the tournament yesterday against Romania. It didn't go to plan. What happened? What went wrong?
Yeah, so I was here, obviously, in Munich for the game. I was there at the stadium. I really don't know what the problem was. It's difficult to really even articulate what happened. It was sort of a full capitulation, really. A problematic first goal as a result of a bit of a keeper and defender misunderstanding, poor pass out, and then the second one, similarly, a slight keeper mistake. And then Ukraine just didn't look like threatening the Romanian goal. Romanians looked a bit more aggressive, a bit hungrier, and deserved winners. And now Ukraine have got it all to do in the final 2 group games.
Can you remind us who they're playing in the final 2 group games? And are these going to be difficult games for them?
Of course. So I think a lot of people expected Ukraine, well, they were favourites against Romania, but Romania obviously won 3-0. And Serhii Rebrov, the manager, said that it was slightly unexpected, that result and how Romania came out and played, in contrast to how they were playing in qualifying and all that kind of thing. And then Ukraine's final 2 games are going to be against Slovakia and then Belgium. And yesterday, Slovakia beat Belgium in another shock. 1-0. So it's not going to be easy or straightforward for Ukraine to make it into the knockout rounds of this tournament. Yes, there is this third place fallback option if you don't finish in the top two, but that's all to do with how many points you've got, what your results are in the remaining two matches. So at the moment, the group is wide open. Let's see, hopefully, maybe Ukraine can recover in these next few matches, but it's going to be a very tough task.
Who was in the crowd for supporting Ukraine then? I mean, we know that adult Ukrainian men aren't allowed to leave the country because of martial law. So who's around supporting the team?
So I think it was a mix. There's massive Ukrainian diaspora in Germany itself. I know a lot of people were coming in from different countries that are around Germany. So Czech Republic, Poland, France. I know a fair few came from the UK as well. And some people came as far as Canada, North America, and elsewhere to support them. And then on top of that, you've got obviously refugees and displaced people that have been living in Germany or in Europe over the past couple of years due to the war. And I think there was a large amount of children and women there, including a few families of fallen football fans that a charity called Stands of Heroes put on a bus for them. And 50 of those family members came all the way from Kiev to actually watch the game. And I think they'll be doing the same for the remaining two matches in the group as well, to give memories and to remember and commemorate the fans that obviously can't be able to watch the games, even if they're, in the front lines or anything like that. So it was quite an eclectic mix, let's say.
I mentioned there in my last question that adult Ukrainian men aren't allowed to leave the country. Could you just explain why the national football team is allowed? What's the thinking behind that?
Well, I think a fair few of Ukraine's professional clubs have got special permission to not be conscripted as a result of the fact that I think they're seen as important assets in promoting Ukraine in global football per se, because some of them will represent Ukraine in Europe and European competitions such as the Champions League, the Europa League and all that kind of thing. And this is the same thinking here. This national team has got a massive opportunity this tournament to promote and to remind people what Ukraine is going through, and obviously to show that Ukraine is still standing and is defiant, but most importantly, just to remind people that the war is still going on and everything that is related to that. And I think that in certain circles, and my opinion as well, is probably more important from those footballers' perspectives, because they have massive followings on social media. They play for big clubs. 4 of them play in the Premier League. 4 of them play in La Liga in Spain. So they've got big audiences that they can actually share all of this stuff through. And as a result of that, I think that's the thinking, that basically these players are important sporting ambassadors, and it's a soft power diplomacy that these guys can do, which is potentially more valuable from their individual perspectives than one of them going on the front line.
Could you tell us a little bit more about some of the players then? I know that some of them are from towns very much immediately impacted by the war in terms of shelling, in terms of bombing. And there was a very moving video put out by the squad in which some of them talk about their backgrounds and where they're from. Could you tell us who should we be paying attention to?
Yeah, absolutely. So that video, I think, was very, very powerful. It showed, I think, 13 members of the team, and it basically shared their hometowns or where they're from and images surrounding what's happened to those villages and towns since the full-scale invasion began. So that includes Mykola Shaparenko, who played in central midfield yesterday. He is from, I think, a Donetsk Oblast city of Novovasilyivka, and that's been completely destroyed by the Russian army. Andriy Lunin, the goalkeeper, Mihailo Mudryk, who plays for Chelsea, they're both from Kharkiv Oblast, Krasnohrad, but obviously Kharkiv Oblast has been heavily impacted, especially over the past few months, and since the full-scale invasion began, by Russian bombing and artillery and everything like that. And then there's a couple of players that are actually from Donetsk itself, that's obviously been occupied for the past 10 years, and one player that was born in Crimea, which is Mykola Matvienko, the Shakhtar centre-back. And so there is an eclectic mix of players that have all been affected, and their families have been affected by this war. And it has, having not just since 2022, but since 2014 as well.
How has the full-scale war impacted the Ukrainian national squad's preparations for the European Championships?
The team have actually not played at home for the past 2.5 years. So whenever they are playing national team matches, they're having to train abroad, and then they're having to play those matches abroad because UEFA doesn't allow matches to take place in Ukraine for their competitions for obvious security reasons. So Ukraine have been playing in the likes of Germany, Czechia, Poland and elsewhere. And as a result of that, that's where what they've been doing. So this tournament, for example, shouldn't be as daunting per se as maybe it could be. But as a result, we saw the result yesterday. Maybe there are other factors at play that Ukraine could and should be working on.
So Romania beat Ukraine 3-0, as you said, a result not many expected. What was the reaction inside Ukraine to that?
A lot of disappointment. Ironically enough, the official broadcast of the national team games actually had a power outage or a signal cut from around midway the second half. So nobody actually caught the remainder of the game in Ukraine for the live anyway, because the broadcaster was cut out. Obviously, that's a sad implication of the energy cuts and everything else that's happening as a result of energy infrastructure damage by Russia. But a lot of dark humour memes were created, obviously, online saying, thank God that we didn't have to watch that remaining half an hour or so. And if only the power cut could have come earlier, because we would have missed the 3 goals that we conceded as well. And then other people were saying Zelensky told D-Tech to switch it off so that no one would have to watch that kind of stuff. But obviously, that's just a bit of banter.
The Ukrainian FA did bring some of the war to Germany. We've seen it in our media as well. Can you tell us, Andrew, about the stadium, the stand that's been transported from, I believe, Kharkiv to Munich and has been put on display?
Yes, so I was there yesterday morning in one of the near Odeonplatz in Munich city centre. The UAF brought, or I think this was combined with the United 24, they brought over a section of a football stand, tribune, so a number of seats and obviously the structure around it that has been heavily damaged by Russian shelling and artillery strikes. And this is a stadium where Ukraine actually trained ahead of Euro 2020, so the last Euros, and also was used by the Netherlands ahead of Euro 2012 and during Euro 2012 because they were based in Kharkiv. So this is a little training stadium. The clubs have played there in the past, but it's just a good example to show the reality that Russia is affecting Ukrainian sports and why they shouldn't be returned to any international competitions and the like for the foreseeable until obviously this war is over and there are changes made in Russia itself.
Andrew, you'll be following the Euros for Ukraine for the entire tournament. They didn't get off to the best start. Could you give us any predictions? What do you think will happen next?
I wish I could tell you. I was expecting a positive result yesterday, but here we are. Fortunately, I'm hoping that there will be some changes. Maybe a new goalkeeper will be given a chance in the net because Lunin didn't really cover himself in glory. Maybe a few other changes outfield too, and hopefully just from the sheer, I don't know, there's been a lot of support for the national team as well over the past 24 hours, just to say, keep your heads up, lads, continue, go on. It's a very young team. I'm hoping that they can just bounce back, and maybe this might be the start of a fairy tale story where Ukraine make it deep into the competition. But that's my heart over my head. I just hope that Ukraine can put on a bit of a show for both the fans that will be in the stadium and those watching back home, if they're able to, just so that they can have a bit of positive emotion, that uplift, because I think everyone needs it at the moment.
And final question, what's the reception to the travelling Ukrainian fans been like? I mean, we saw some suggestion on social media that on some of the other games there have been Russian flags on display. What have you sensed? What have you seen?
Well, yes, I think the Russian flags at the opening game against Germany between Scotland was an obvious provocation. That's obviously some locals, however, probably living in Germany, who knows, that were presenting that flag in the Scotland end and I guess trying to rile up the thing. Sadly, UEFA have said that for other games other than Ukraine matches, the Russian flag is allowed because it's a national flag. It's not provocative, in inverted commas, of course. And however, for Ukraine matches, the Russian flags are banned because they have been persuaded, thanks to the Ukrainian Association of Football, UEFA have agreed that it can be seen as a security risk. And that was also on display during Serbia versus England, because obviously Serbia and Russia have got close ties and so have their football fans. However, the Romanian fans during the game, there were some, I guess, psyops that were put out by Russian media and elsewhere on Telegram and the like, where they put a video of Romanian fans in the Allianz or the Munich Arena yesterday where they were chanting Putin, but it has been debunked. That was fake. That was edited audio on top of that. And as well, there was a photo where someone photoshopped a flag of the Donetsk People's Republic in the stand of the Romanian fans, which was also a fake. So Romanians and Ukrainians very much all friendly. All the city centre was great. We were speaking to people afterwards. It was all good natured, and hopefully that can continue going forward for Ukraine's other matches too.
Absolutely. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us. It's been really good to hear from you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Now let's go to our final thoughts with Dom Nicholls.
Final thoughts. I was a member of the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards, and I note with pride and passion that today is Waterloo Day, 209 years after the Battle of Waterloo, June the 18th, 1815, when a tyrannical bully had his plans for a land grab in Europe defeated on the battlefield. The Royal Scots Greys were there, the forerunners. They amalgamated in 71 to form the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards, for those that are interested. And one of the French regiments was duffed up. The 45th Regiment of Infantry were duffed up, and Sergeant Ewart rode through on his grey and took the eagle of the 45th, and he was immediately promoted on the battlefield to ensign, which is lieutenant these days. And hence you've got at the top of the Royal Mile in Scotland, you've got the Ensign Ewart pub. I recommend going in there. But anyway, I note Battle of Waterloo, Wellington at the time was said to have remarked that the victory was a damn close run thing, and Europe was only delivered by the late arrival of German military hardware. They turned up late in the afternoon. The late arrival of German military hardware saved the day, and as I'm celebrating Waterloo Day today, I just wonder if there's a message in there today for late arrival of German military hardware. I'm searching for it, but I'm not quite sure. But that's me, David.
O flower of Scotland, when will we see your likes again, that fought and died for your wee bit hill and glen, and stood against him, proud Edward's army, and sent him homeward to think again. Those days are past now, and in the past they must remain, but we can still rise now, and be that nation again who stood against him, proud Edward's army, and sent him homeward to think again.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Rachel Porter, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.